Hello, my friend. I thought I was able to finish in the last video. I apologize. I'm going on now. I think this is going to be video number 6 covering Erich Fromm, Man for Himself. I hope that you're doing well today. I hope that everything is going good. I left off in the last video on page 170. And so today we're moving forward through the problems of humanistic ethics. He talks about Kafka's book, The Trial, a very tragic book. Again, he uses it to attack Calvin's theology. And he spends time talking about that. He frequently references Spinoza. He references many different ancient thinkers from Greek and Roman times. Aristippus, who was the first representative of hedonistic theory. Epicurus, you might have heard of Epicurus as the promoter of pleasure in Roman times. True pleasure consists in serenity of mind and the absence of fear, according to Epicurus. So he goes on to talk about him. He brings up Aristotle, Plato, talking about what are good pleasures, what are bad pleasures, all because he's trying to reconcile the idea of the humanistic conscience, which doesn't rely on any external influence. It only relies on the inner logic of man. Every neurosis confirms the fact that pleasure can be in contradiction to man's real interests. So he runs into a roadblock. He starts arguing for pleasure, and then he realizes, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't really lead to a good place after all. Unhappiness weakens or even paralyzes all our psychic functions. Happiness increases them. And he shows his dedication to Freud when he says a dream may reveal the real truth of our inner motivations. So Freud depended a lot on dreams, and Freud was overly concerned with the motivations based on sex, which Fromm wisely disagrees with. And so we continue on. He returns again to the theme of productivity. He says the lack of productivity and the resulting powerlessness and fear are the root of these irrational desires that humans have and irrational cravings. So we continue on. He says that humanistic ethics postulates happiness and joy as the chief virtues, but it leads to the most difficult task for man, and that is the full development of his productiveness. So again, Fromm promotes the idea of humanistic ethics when it is based in productivity. That's his result. But again, if we follow that to its extreme, where does it lead? It leads to totalitarianism. The idea that humans should simply be a cog in the machine of economic productivity. And in fact, if it was applied to democratic environments, the result would be the same. That humans can only be happy when they are gainfully employed and contributing to the economy, which we know is not always true. He says here, in fact, he himself describes the dilemma. He says, people work in order to make more money. They use this money in order to make still more money. At the end, the enjoyment of life is lost sight of. People are in a hurry, so they invent things to have more time. Then they use the time saved to rush around again to save more time until they're so exhausted that they don't have any use of the time that they saved. We become enmeshed in a net of means and have lost sight of the ends. So he spends a lot of time talking about the ends and the means. He introduces the philosophers Dewey and Spencer, and he alternatively agrees and disagrees with them at different times. We move on to another section on page 200, faith as a character trait. And he quotes Emerson, belief consists in accepting the affirmations of the soul, unbelief in denying them. He says here, the first sentence, faith is not one of the concepts that fits into the intellectual climate of the present day world. He admits that. The present day world, he's writing in 1939, rejects faith. It's based only on facts, only on what you can measure with a slide rule, only on what you can measure with your eyes in the physical reality. So his world, which extends today, has rejected the idea of faith. But since he has such a strong knowledge of Scripture, he wants to cling to faith, and so he supports it by saying that faith is more or less the basic attitude of a person. So he says if a person has good attitude, that means they're displaying faith, and if they have a bad attitude, that means they're not displaying faith, they're displaying doubt instead. And so he spends a lot of time talking about of faith and doubt. And it's interesting, he makes a quote here. For irrational faith, the sentence credo quia absurdum est, which is Latin for I believe because it is absurd, has psychological validity. If somebody makes a statement which is rationally sound, he does what in principle everyone else can do. If, however, he dares to make a statement which is rationally absurd, he shows by this very fact that he has transcended the faculty of common sense and thus has a magic power which puts him above the average person. And this is what has been used to their advantage by today's intellectual elites. And he even uses the biblical story of the liberation from the Egyptians as an example of this irrational faith, he calls it. Just a little interesting segue that he included there. Again, he returns to his idea of productivity, the basis of rational faith. So he separates faith based on the metaphysical, faith based on the absolute, and he brings in the concept of rational faith. And he says the basis of rational faith is, you can guess it, productiveness, right? It keeps returning to productivity as being the end all and the be all for humanity. He says anything that's not based in facts is irrational faith, and he doesn't support that. He says men cannot live without faith. The crucial question for our generation and the next ones is whether this faith will be an irrational faith in leaders, machines, success, or the rational faith in man based on the experience of our own productive activity. He's wrong, right? The faith that is required is faith in a loving God that cares about his creation, even down to the individual. This is what we were taught by the great teacher. This is what we were taught by Christ, that the very hairs of your head are all numbered, that God cares about you so much, you as an individual person. This is the beauty of what I would call faith. I don't separate it into rational and irrational. I don't call it irrational because it's metaphysical. I say it's faith because it's been delivered to us as a revelation. Christ came and he said, hey, guess what? The God that you have a fuzzy idea about, I can clarify that idea for you. You were thinking that maybe this is God, or maybe that person is a God, or maybe Caesar is God, or maybe the trees are God. No, I'll clear it up for you. God is the creator of the universe. He's your heavenly Father, and he cares specifically about you, so much that the hairs of your head are all numbered. He said he feeds the birds. How much more will he feed and clothe you? He said a single bird doesn't fall to the ground without his knowledge. How much more does he care about you? He doesn't want you to die unnecessarily or futilely or without any purpose. He wants you to be, as Fromm mentions, productive. We're told in Jeremiah 29 that he has plans to prosper you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Even if you have one day left to live, it still means he's got plans to bless you and prosper you and bring you to heaven with dignity, to survive the humiliation of old age, the humiliation of death that we all have to go through. We all have to go through it. That is our heritage as human beings. That's what we inherited from time immemorial, from the Garden of Eden. Doesn't mean that we inherited it in a fatalistic sense, that we have this fatalistic idea that we all have to be evil. No, that's not what it's talking about. It talks about the fact that he wants to live through us. And how would he want to live through us if he's already taken all the pain and the suffering and the torture that was necessary to experience? He doesn't want to have us go through all that over and over and over again. No, of course not. It says that he gladly wants to give us the kingdom. He gladly wants us to be happy, lead happy and productive lives with dignity, happiness, joy, fellowship with one another in unity, all these wonderful good things. He lists them out as the fruits of God's Spirit: love, joy, peace, happiness, all kinds of wonderful results that he wants us to have. And it is absolutely missed by humanistic ethics. Humanistic ethics misses the boat completely. It says, oh, we can only depend on what we can pull out of man's own bootstraps, right? Man has to pick himself up and be productive on his own. And the only way he can be productive is by being a cog in the machine. He's got to contribute to the state, whether that state is under democracy. It leads to a corporatocracy that controls everything. He's got to have that job. Otherwise, he's worthless. Or under the totalitarian, where he has to do the same thing. He's got to contribute to the state and sweep that street, do his duty, whatever it is he's supposed to do. Doesn't matter the political ideology that he's living under. Humanistic ethics leads to the same result. That man is totally dependent on himself to contribute to productivity, and after that he dies, and then there's nothing after that. That's the end. That's his only purpose, is to live, to try and be as productive as possible. If he can be selfish in the meantime to scrape away a little bit of happiness for himself, all the better, according to humanistic ethics. But beyond that, there's nothing. There is no purpose, there is no hope, there is no afterlife. It's a very fatalistic view, it's a very depressing view that results from believing in the concept of humanistic ethics. So, the title Man for Himself, it leads to man for nothingness, really. He quotes Socrates, he quotes Augustine, Pelagius, Thomas Aquinas. He even mentions from the Old Testament that man's strivings are evil from childhood, and how there were these arguments between Augustine and Pelagius, and Augustine won out, and he said that this determination that humans were evil from birth darkened man's mind for centuries, he says. Well, they didn't darken man's mind for centuries. They influenced man's minds for centuries. But because they didn't know the way of escape, they might have darkened man's mind for centuries. He goes on to quote Nietzsche and his radical rebellion against anything to do with metaphysical authority. And he comes to the conclusion that the choice between life and death is indeed the basic alternative of ethics. And this is even a scriptural concept as well, where God says, I've set before you life and death, therefore choose life. Scripture tells us that God has given us the choice, that we actually have choice. You say, oh no, there's no choice because everything is predetermined, and if God is all powerful, then there is no choice. No, that's not how he created his creation. You can't outguess God. You can't second guess God. He said, I've created a situation where you can have the choice to choose what you want for yourself. That's the gift that he's given humanity, right? He's made us in his own image. He's given us creative capability, the creative capability to choose. And not to choose is also a choice, right? So Fromm goes back and he says, man is not necessarily evil, but becomes evil only if the proper conditions for his growth and development are lacking. In other words, if he doesn't have access to being productive, then he becomes evil. So Fromm reaches a brick wall in trying to explain the evil that is often evident in humanity. He says, oh, it must have been their environment. He says, that's what happened. He tries to, he detests Calvin because Calvin promoted the ideas of guilt and anxiety and didn't have a satisfactory solution for them. All that Calvin and Luther were able to suggest is to throw yourself on the mercy of God. And so they weren't able to enunciate a clearer solution than that. And Fromm comes to the conclusion, he returns to the statement of do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. And he says, well, it's equally justifiable to state whatever you do to others, you also do to yourself. So he expands on that statement, and he keeps returning to it and trying to reconcile it. It really is a story. It is a story of man's conflict within himself in trying to reconcile religion to logic. That's what he's battling against. But in particular, I would say a certain form of religion, that of Calvinism, which caused him so much internal pain. Productivity, again, the productive orientation that Fromm promotes, is the basis for freedom, virtue, and happiness. This is the conclusion that he comes to at the end of the book. He talks a little bit about freedom of will versus determinism, and the motivation for him writing this book. This is where he says, is it not true that the more insight we have into the conditions which are responsible for the formation of character and its dynamics, the more inescapable seems the view that no person can be morally judged? This is the conclusion that he comes to. He says, if you look at all the conditions that are responsible for forming a person's character, then no person can be morally judged. And in essence, he's right, because the only person that can judge a person is God. Only God knows what each person has gone through in their lives. And so, because he interprets Calvinism and Lutheranism as morally judging people, he fights against that throughout the book because of his understanding that the formation of character is dependent upon unique conditions for each individual. And so, you have to give him some credit for his insights into the human condition. He says, there's perhaps no phenomena which contains so much destructive feeling as moral indignation. I went over time. I'm sorry. I'll just try and finish up here. Which permits envy or hate to be acted out under the guise of virtue. Very good point that we should remember today. The indignant person has for once the satisfaction of despising and treating a creature as inferior, coupled with the feeling of his own superiority and righteousness. And he says that we can escape from that by adopting humanistic ethics. But humanistic ethics, as well as authoritarian ethics, can both lead to that same condition that I just mentioned. So we're winding down. We're running out of time here. I'm going to try and finish this off. I guess this will be my last video. I could make one more short video. Maybe I'll finish up. There's one more chapter, which is the moral problem of today, chapter 5. I'll leave that for today. I've reached page 238. I'll make one more quick video tomorrow to just finish up this book. That'll be video number 7. So this is video number 6. Thank you for your patience in getting through this. I hope some of it makes sense to you, and I hope some of it is a benefit to you. I'll leave you with this one last quote. He says, understanding a person does not mean condoning. It only means that one does not accuse him as if one were God or a judge placed above him. So to understand a person doesn't mean you have to condone what they do. It just means that you don't accuse him as if one were God or a judge placed above him. This is where Erich Fromm begins to go as he finishes up his book. He begins to explain to the reader how much he wants to escape from any kind of moral judgment, both within himself and both from others. And so I'll leave that at page 238, and we're reaching the point. The next topic is absolute versus relative, universal versus socially immanent ethics, which he discusses for a little bit. Thank you for watching. God bless you. Have yourself a great day. We'll do one last final video tomorrow. That'll be video number 7, and that'll be it. I promise you. Then we'll move on to something much more productive and positive. This has been a bit of a slog. I understand it's been a bit of a depressing read, but I really appreciate your patience. We'll talk to you again tomorrow. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.